So Jen and I both read and slowly digested the policymakers' summary from the IPCC report. We did not read the full report. I actually had to look up a ton of terms just to read the 41-page summary. I have a PhD. Jen is a third-year PhD student, graduate student, and we sort of struggled through this. But there is so much to unpack from this report. And I think a lot of really it was like a nail biter to read. Like, you know, when you're reading a book or something and it's like a good story and you're just like, it's like you can't wait to keep turning the page and get to the end just because you're just engrossed in what's happening in the thing that you're reading. I actually felt that way about the IPCC report. I read each sentence, even if I didn't understand it, like very carefully. I reread sentences and passages. I carefully studied the graphs because I'm actually terrible at understanding graphs and charts. There are many, but I really wanted to be able to understand what this report was saying, and to be able to bring it to you all and kind of translate it a bit, some of the key takeaways from the report. So just a little bit more about kind of how the report looks for those who haven't been able to read it. So you can find this summary for policymakers. The language is easier, I would say, to understand probably than the high science kind of language in the full report. And so it's easier, obviously, to digest for policymakers. But you can find this online. You can easily Google it and download the PDF, and you yourself kind of make your way through the IPCC summary for policymakers. There are 3 parts. Part A is the current state of the climate. Part B is titled Possible Climate Futures. And then Part C is entitled Climate Information for Risk Assessment and Regional Adaptation. So that's kind of the basic layout of the report. The report or the summary is mostly bullet points and graphs and charts that give us really specific data, allow us to predict what kind of is going to be happening over the next, I believe it's like 2060 to kind of 2100 are the years that are kind of the targets. And it compares the numbers of what's going to be happening over the next, 40 to 80 years? Am I counting right? 40 to 80 years with what has happened in kind of the previous, what was it, it's 1850 to 1900 is the window, right, Jen?
Wait, for what? For what?
They're comparing they kind of look at things over the course of decades, like the decades of
Yeah.
development. And so they're looking not necessarily at like yearly changes, but they're calling them decadal changes or like decades, and then also centuries. And then they're also looking at things in a much larger time frame in terms of like thousands of years as well. And so this is kind of the scale that the summary and the report addresses, kind of spanning over this period of time and comparing what's happened sort of within the last 40 years and what's going to be happening in the next 40 to 80 years with what had happened sort of prior to kind of the early 20th century and into kind of the mid 19th century. Of course, Industrial Revolution kind of scale and trying to think back through history about how things have changed and how things have changed in a really accelerated manner. I believe it's since 1960. So I'm hoping I'm giving a good outline of the summary. I know it's a lot of numbers and stuff, but so yeah, let's maybe talk a little bit. Do you want to talk about the tricontinental breakdown first of the report, and then we can kind of weave in some of the facts from the report itself? I'm going to hand it over to you, Jen, to maybe get us started on the conversation, because I think that the tricontinental did a really good kind of entry point analysis, kind of political analysis of the significance of the IPCC report for Indigenous people, but also organizers.
Yeah, absolutely. I highly recommend reading this. It's very brief and it's just very to the point. And so it starts by talking about Indigenous Aboriginal people in Australia and their efforts to protect the coral reef. And it turns out 70% of the Earth's coral reefs are threatened, with 20% already destroyed, with no hope for recovery. And the remaining reefs are at risk of imminent collapse. And another quarter are at risk for long-term threats. And for those of you who don't know, coral reefs maintain some of the most diverse ecosystems on Earth. And when they're destroyed, when they're collapsed, we lose those entire ecosystems. And so indigenous people for a long time have had relationships with those ecosystems. I know that even for us here in the Southwest, coral is of sacred significance. It's something that we wear for protection. And so what the people there were saying was that for, thousands of years, they've had stories passed on about how to care for these environments, for how to care for our non-human relatives. But now, with the unprecedented destruction of these coral reefs, they don't know how to prepare for something that is completely unprecedented, and something that is happening so rapidly. And so the the newsletter drops the very bleak fact that if warming continues to reach 3 degrees Celsius, which is 37.4 degrees Fahrenheit, by 2060, and 5.7 degrees Celsius, or 42.26 Fahrenheit, by 2100, human extinction is certain. And that very much echoes the Red Deal's assertion that our choices are decolonization or extinction. And even later in this report, it references when Evo Morales said at the People's Gathering in Cochabamba that we have to choose between Pachamama or Mother Earth and multinationals. And so it seems like that call is kind of just reiterated in a bunch of different ways, right? And it's primarily coming from indigenous people who understand how high the stakes are. And this newsletter also asserts that it is because the global north countries have already taken the planet to the threshold of annihilation, that the world is at risk as a whole, and that these global north countries have done this even before global south countries have been able to attain basic needs like electricity, and that 54 countries on the African continent account for only 2 to 3% of global carbon emissions, while half of Africa's 1.2 billion people have no access to electricity. Meanwhile, the continent is getting the brunt of extreme climate change events like droughts, cyclones, floods, and desertification. And I think it's very apparent to people now, just this past summer alone, how severe and how blatant the impacts of climate change are. It's absolutely undeniable. At this point, you don't need necessarily to look at a report or to see these statistics to understand and physically feel these impacts. Looking at social media, looking at the news, looking at these fires, looking at these mass die-offs, it's something that people have a lot of anxiety about. And what we're interested in doing is looking at how to turn those anxieties into revolutionary action, because it's very important, and I'm very happy that people are now coming to terms with our reality. But how do we move forward, and how do we prevent people from getting demoralized in this truly apocalyptic scenario we're in?